I know you're looking for an answer to that, but I will say one answer is to diversify the groups, and we have that. We have a lot of different funding sources for research. It's not just one agency in the U.S., for example. There are multiple agencies that fund research. There are universities that fund research by themselves. There are private individuals that do research themselves. Even just individuals who have an interest will do that work. And if it's done according to a scientific method, and it has a legitimacy that can be peer-reviewed, then if you took all that information in a sort of a clearinghouse, and you can test that against another study, then you will see whether or not one approach says this, and then another approach says the opposite. But then you look at both of those approaches, they may have come from completely different sides. They may actually be saying the same thing. Where sometimes it's just a matter of taking that information and looking at it in a perspective. Now, we have that somewhat on the international scale. The IPCC is a intergovernmental panel on climate change, where the UN provides the impetus and organization to gather different research and scientists to collectively debate the value of this different research. The IPCC has provided reports on the effect of where we are with climate change over a number of years, and that information is published. Whether or not we choose to accept this information and act upon it is a different thing. And why I say how then we act upon it is really the question. How do we look at the information that we're provided with? So, for example, if we see that the temperature is rising, and we're seeing that there is a steady, we know that there's let's assume that we see there's a steady temperature rise, and if we don't do anything, there's going to be some problems.
But hold on. Yeah. Now you're tying action to data, right?
Yes.
Assuming that action will have the influence on the data.
Yes.
So I guess that where does that assumption come from, right? And I'm not trying to challenge it. I'm just saying you said it in such a way that it's a belief. I'm just trying to unpack that a little.
So, assuming we have data that we know what is right now, okay, and that data is understood with a certain amount of certainty. That, let's say we have a 99% confidence, and confidence levels are actually a statistical science, so that you can say that there is a 99% chance that we have confidence that there is a human influence on climate change, that the warming is induced by human activity. If you can say that with 99% certainty, then since it's human induced, we can unpack our human influence. So then that's a different question. What should we do? Now, let's say we don't know necessarily scientifically whether or not methane is a major contributor. Maybe there's a certain confidence level with that. Maybe tailpipe emissions is an influencer, and we have a certain confidence in that. Then that confidence level could drive a policy as to what we should do. Let's say if we decide that we want to reduce CO2 emissions or all global warming gases, which has a global warming potential. Methane has a global warming potential.
Before we jump into that, so let's look at that question, I guess, in that belief, right? Let's look at both sides. I think you started jumping into the side of what do we do if we believe that humans can change, right? But let's say, for instance, humans cannot change or do not. I'm not saying that this is true or not. I'm just saying, then what is the response? Is the response to screw it? Let's open up coal plants everywhere. Let's, so I guess what do you see the response being if there's no human intervention that can change the state and change of the world?
I don't know. I can only say that we as a society, through a process of politics, we decide what we should do. And right now we have in place mechanisms that we react to certain influences through a government process. So if we say we're seeing a threat to our environment through our ability to survive as a race, that is actually still a question. What if these projections are true? Then what's going to happen? If we have a 99% confidence level that the sea levels will rise and our atmosphere would become so clouded that the production of food would create starvation. If we had a 99% confidence level about that, people would, I think, rightfully freak out. But where the forecasts are uncertain, creates uncertainty to individuals. And I guess that's why, again, I think having certainty and having an even course as to our activity, what we should do, is the best course. And to reduce that uncertainty is where we should be focused. So, hey, you want to spend money on certain research? Well, perhaps reduce that uncertainty in the minds of the public.
So, I guess, isn't it interesting that there is uncertainty in so many different perspectives in the space, right? So, what could that be a signal of, right? That the data isn't clear enough, the person or people don't have enough information that is easily read, right? And there's also the conflict, right, from both sides that are kind of looking at it. The issue with having unclear information or absolute information is then you have resistance as far as either side moving forward, which if this is a time-based, equation here where we've got to, change the way we produce or change or consume energy, that then there's the resistance there doesn't aid at all in either side moving forward. Right. So and then the question becomes, once you actually, like, if you look at electric cars, right? There are hybrid cars for a long time, the Prius, things like that. But then you have a new player in the field, right? For instance, Tesla, that makes every electric car a supercar, right? 0 to 60 in 3 to 5 seconds. It looks great. It's modern. It's slick. There's a lot of benefits there, and people rush to buy that versus the Prius that maybe was also efficient, and so I guess what I wish there was more of, people would buy a Prius because they believe they want to save the environment and etc. Right? But more people maybe that don't even think about the environmental reasons may buy something just because it's more efficient, it's better, and for use of a better term, it's cooler, right? So I guess how do you make some of these changes cooler and more excellent on almost every level, so then that there isn't this kind of hard push and transition from one way to another? And then I also want to just add another layer to this. The world currently is broken up to many different countries that have many different ways of functioning, establishing themselves, making their own decisions, and we all live under the same atmosphere in which it all influences the climate in different ways.
Yes.
The U.S. has about a third of the population of some of the biggest countries in the world, like China and India. So to some degree, if the data is so true, right, theoretically you should be able to convince every country on Earth to then take that same position. But you're potentially not seeing that, or even if the U.S. says we're going to completely revamp everything, our small percentage of the population and output and energy usage and all that, may not even make a dent to save the entire system. Right.
You raise a number of good points, and the first one that you raised was confidence in the science. And for myself, I'm always going to be focused, with at least my organization, to give people confidence and that our work is credible and can be relied upon. And to do so, for myself, a lot of the reasons why people do not trust science is that they feel it's political. And so to eliminate the perception of any impropriety of that scientific process. But then the next part is what you're saying is like how people, what are their values? What do you think people think they should do? For example, buying a Prius. I would have gotten a Prius if I had a car, but I don't have a car. I live without a car. I commute. I walk. I take public transportation. Not really simply because it's environmentally friendly. It's just that's just my lifestyle.
Right. That's also the culture of New York. Right. Okay.
Whereas others will make extraordinary efforts. They'll only eat food that has been ethically cultivated or farmed or harvested. They won't. They'll recycle everything. They won't consume plastic goods. Things. Listen, that's all fine and good, but in a large macro world, having a few individuals doing these small things is great, but I think it has a very less impact upon the whole sphere of influence of climate change in the world. I believe one of the things we can do, at least today, is to continue to reduce the fractiousness of the conversation, and to reduce the ability of individuals to take information and I'm not saying reduce their ability, but to counter that with real information. So if we have, in the U.S., for example, instead of an executive committee, which will change every year, which studies the issue of climate change, is to have something more like the Open Market Committee that has a bipartisan group of stakeholders that represent various perspectives, various points of view, that survives the political cycle, and then maintain the sanctity of science, the field of science, as to pure endeavor without political affiliation. So we trust the inputs, and then you have a group of individuals who can take those inputs and go through it on the U.S. side to say, hey, should we be doing windmills? Should we reduce the cows so we don't have so many cow farts? Should we reduce tailpipe emissions? What do we want?
It's kind of interesting because there's most of the conversation today comes from a reductionist standpoint, right? How do we reduce this, reduce that? And on the other end, is our energy use also reducing, right? How many electronics were in a household in the 50s versus today on a per person level? I mean, it seems like the way that society is moving is to only add more technology and moving. It's easier to travel because it's cheaper and all these things. And you save much more time traveling. So is there also a different perspective or a different set of kind of people that are mobilized in capturing the carbon? Because essentially, if you are able to, and by the way, I think the best outcome in this situation is that you're able to then completely and entirely shift, any change in climate, whether we're going to an ice age, into an ice age, or getting much hotter, right? Because you could be so efficient at carbon capture, and we may be revolving around the sun or in the galaxies in a certain way that we look at the opposite issue, which what happens in that case, right? If we're on the brink of an ice age, is everyone going to be handed out Hummers? Are we going to burn tire pits? I guess I think it's less so how do we solve this one issue, but then instead it's how do we control the entire ecosystem so that we're able to avoid future issues?
Yeah, well, you touched on another thing is really what we value. Are we here talking about this question because we want to maintain the status quo as of the state of the climate as of, let's say, 1970s or 1950s, the trees and everything, or do we want to go back? Do we want to be a reduction? We don't want to reduce our productivity and go back to the Stone Age, or do we go for a different direction? Let's be more spending money on fusion technology, clean energy technologies without the CO2 impact, or let's say we go at a different direction. We want to save lives instead of concern about CO2. If the value is of our decisions is let's save lives instead of have a view of the world as this green state as of 1950s or 1970s, then let's invest in mosquito netting to save people's lives in areas that are affected by malaria. So if you put your value on saving lives, then you spend your money in one way. If you value this green concept, maybe it's something else. And if you decide, hey, it's that. Maybe it's just a perception that we value, the perception that we're being good stewards of the environment, and therefore I'm going to take a bike. Therefore, I'm going to donate to this charitable cause. But it depends on what you value. I mean,
Right. But even that value, or even that participation, is that a false belief that what you're doing is going to move the needle in any way or another? Even if all 330 million Americans took that same position, there's still 8 billion people in the world, many of whom don't have the privilege of an economy and a technological state of America, right? That are just looking to get by and establish themselves within the world, right? So how does that come into play? Because assuming every single person here has essentially has zero output from a carbon standpoint, but you still have a world outside that's trying to establish themselves. By the way, not as an as a carbon neutral, or they're trying to eat our lunch while we're over here kind of distracted to some degree.
Well, we do also have national values. So blowing it up, not just the individual scale, we have national values of national security, energy security. There is a concept of pollution of the commons. We have global commons. This is the atmosphere that we all share, and that pollution of the global commons affects each nation individually. So, for example, a smokestack in Ottawa can deposit acid rain in the Northeast, for example, and that pollution, affects, crosses the international boundary.
Right.
So we have national interests, and that's still also subject to that political cycle. But I think the long-term issue is what if we see that as on a global scale. If things do not change as the IPC suggests, if as their forecast we are going to see a 5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature over by 2050, or more, if that comes to bear, what will happen? And the what ifs. People will say, more hurricanes. Well, not necessarily. The hurricanes are, you might assume that more energy in the system will create larger hurricanes, more intense hurricanes, or more frequent hurricanes. But that's not necessarily so. But how is it going to affect us? Is it going to change the rainfall patterns where certain areas of the country are not receiving enough rain to produce food, and so you'll have countries, let's say in Africa, who are going to suffer by the change in rain pattern, and that's going to create potentially a disruption, and usually those disruptions are warfare.
Right. So I mean, and then that seems like more of a like you're reacting to the changes that are to come, right? So there's like almost there's a few base camps here. I don't want to say there's only a certain amount. There's reducing, on a personal level, on a state level, etc. There's reacting, but going back to the point earlier, what is the proactive way to kind of take control of the environment and find ways to manipulate it by either that's capturing that, adding carbon back into the atmosphere if we're going to the ice age route. Is there any projects that you're aware of that have taken that approach?
There are a number of research opportunities for carbon capture. There are a number of things.
Right.
In addition, we're looking at other aspects of the equation, and not just CO2 in the atmosphere. Methane, for example. Studying the effect of the increase of temperature as to the release of methane in the permafrost up in the tundra. These are things that we're thinking about how we can potentially alleviate these things. Planting trees and reducing deforestation. Those are things. Reducing the pollution of the oceans is an issue. Not just for reducing the plastics, for example, the great gyre out in the Pacific, but also to allow us to maintain a safe food supply such that we won't have to worry so much about impacts to our production of agriculture on land. We can still rely on the seas as a food source because the seas are, a significant portion of the surface of the Earth, and sort of an untapped area of exploration as well. We know so little about it, even though that we're still maintaining on the same sphere of the Earth.
Right. Absolutely. It's kind of interesting because there's this company. It's called Ocean Cleanup, started by a very young guy named Boyan Slot, and he's essentially developed and started to build out these ocean cleanup boat systems or their net systems, and they also focus a lot on river systems because that's essentially where it starts, so they eventually flow out into the ocean. What's interesting from a cultural level is there's probably more people that know of Greta Thunberg, who I'm sure is involved in some degree of ruining Europe today. Is from an energy standpoint, from all of those reductions in sources. What's interesting from a cultural standpoint is you have people who are more focused on somebody yelling at them, essentially, without the data, without the information, but just strong emotion. And you have another young individual who starts a company that actually provides solutions. So that complicates things, right? Because in some degree, you've got to be a good marketer, right? All the best artists were also good marketers, So I guess how does it's like, I guess what we were getting at before is there's so much data that's collected. You've got groups of individuals who dedicate their lives living in harsh environments, putting together all of this different data, and then that transfer from that data being crunched into numbers into something that can be more easily understood by a layperson. And then you've got that transfer from there to that layperson or to that agency that has funded that, where you see a lot of potential manipulation.
Well, I think we have let's just talk about Europe. Communities of they have different values, and so Germany, for example, very much is concerned about their environment because it's old Europe, and they are somewhat meticulous in terms of their organization. So you may have 7 different categories of recyclables. And they've made extraordinary efforts throughout Europe to go to green energy. Windmills, certain types of dam systems, all to reduce the impact on carbon. But you realize that there are also other effects. They have made that choice, and instead of perhaps working on other things that would, as a nation, provide other benefit. For example, improving the use of nuclear, and where many countries had really made advances in the use of nuclear, which now is old technology, and how then to address the perception of nuclear as a safe alternative, instead of providing expensive and somewhat of a blight on the landscape of the windmills, these great big airfoils, which only have a certain lifetime. It's a perception of, hey, I feel like I'm doing good. I feel like I'm approaching this matter in an effective way.
Right. Well, there's that, right, where you're building these windmills which potentially use a large number of carbon-driven production that you hope will eventually return a net positive, right? And that's one of the arguments that we've seen for why or against that, right? There's nuclear, which also from a cultural standpoint has negative connotations from previous incidents, but on a whole per basis of output, you've seen fewer deaths in nuclear than you have in coal or other ways of generating. Even those turbines kill animals that fly into them, right? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, or the choices that we may make with respect to electric cars. And I would say there's another law that you have to say. There's the law of unintended consequences. You choose one thing for a benefit, a good thing, and then there may be unintended negative consequences.
Right.
So, for example, the electric cars, where we like the electric car, well, it's cool. Right. But you need to mine the certain rare earth, other elements that are required for storage of batteries and the materials that make up these sophisticated components. And to do so, you are exporting negative externalities on other countries, which then you have to pay for in another way, another social cost.
Right. So you could say, we have green ways of producing energy, but then you import your oil or whatever that may be from a country that doesn't observe those same things, but somehow there's that disconnects people from their guilt, perspective, way that they score themselves as far as achieving what they're out to achieve. So exporting your guilt doesn't mean that somewhere around the globe, these other types of systems aren't in play and being used, right? And we saw that from a political standpoint. Like with Germany and what's happening in Russia, you put a certain amount of sanctions on this one country that is also feeding you, and you're also feeding them by sending them billions and billions of dollars for your energy.
It seems to be an inconsistent policy. Yes. Yeah.
Which you would hope the people who are making those types of decisions are at least aware of, maybe not the data and what happens on the field, but at least what's happening as far as the inflows and outflows of what they're governing, right? So that potentially becomes a question of, are people just to some degree incompetent or unaware or not looking closely as they expect scientists and people looking at a large set of data, not looking at their own internal data, and also with this idea of the exporting of guilt and allowing that to happen in other places, it kind of boggles the mind. From a cultural standpoint, that's not observed or seen as bad as producing it locally. Whereas, at least if you're producing something locally, you've got control of the refining, the creation, the export. That puts you in a position where you go to war with other countries or have disagreements with other countries. You don't have to say sorry and beg for those energy sources in the same way that you're seeing today. So,
well, I think we are most often seeing issues with. We all have the same access to the information. It's just how we look at it and how we proceed. I see just so much short-term decision making, and it's very reactive decision making, and not looking at these issues in the long term. China has looked at their issues in a longer time scale. Their values are different than ours, and I think that's one thing that we need to look at. We need to look at our values and to be honest with ourselves. Really, what do we want? Do we want to have an Earth that is reducing CO2 and looking at the age of the Jetsons, but also with green parks? Is that what we want? If you take a picture, what is your vision? Is your vision to have a great economy and producing a lot of material? Is your vision to have a sufficient amount of energy output? China has engaged in this enormous dam system that produces electricity. That, despite the fact that it's actually slowed the Earth's rotation slightly, produces an enormous amount of energy relatively efficiently, despite the fact that it's difficult to transport electricity, without the tailpipe emissions, and has allowed them to produce and fuel their factories. Perhaps this is what we should look at. Well, we need to have, if we want to be productive, if we want to maintain an economy with a certain degree of productivity, we should be looking at inexpensive or good energy sources domestically, and maintaining that over a long period of time without having to worry about these great fluctuations in energy supply. For example, restricting oil or going to tap ANWR. These are things that we don't necessarily need to ask ourselves if we have a long-term strategy of maintaining a certain energy level. And China has done that.
Right. I mean, they also run into issues with blackouts and things of that nature. There's, I have factories that I work with that, stop production for a certain amount of time. And so it's not a perfect system, but I think the idea of bringing your energy production in-house or creating systems in-house that allow you to then not have to, that's also a double-edged sword, right? If you don't have to then rely on other people, that may affect, the benefit of trade, which is, leads to more peace, I guess, on a, it's interesting. I guess I wonder where this goes in the future, because if we take the status of how do we improve, reduce, conserve, react, but not as aggressively, how do we turn to then be more proactive and carbon capture and offsetting those things, but also on a larger level, how do you actually control the heating and cooling as a general type of tool? You could even say potentially a weapon. But if you were able to then control that, then you would open up a landscape, and then in which you could use as much energy as you could get a hold of, right? So, what does an economy, what does a society look like with unlimited energy versus one that has very little, right? If you go to the very little standpoint, if you don't have a way to create a light source at night, you've essentially reduced the production output based on whether the sun is out, right? But if you had an unlimited amount of energy, then you could potentially, I guess that's one of those things, right? Like even today, our phones have gone from 1G all the way to 5G, right? And you might say at a certain point, why do you need a 6G, a 7G? My Simpsons episode is downloading very quick, right? But what you start to see is that people start developing different ways to create. Essentially, instead of pixels, they're creating voxels, these 3D pixels. You're able to then overlay things in the world, understand the world more clearly, which allows you to process information much more clearly, which can lead us to autonomous vehicles. It can lead us to AI robots that can then understand the world and offload a lot of the kind of basic tasks of manufacturing and care that then free you up to, instead of spending 8 hours doing administrative tasks as for example, as a worker, you then have those 8 hours to use your brain for what it's better at, right? Yeah. Not being a calculator or an inputter, but more creative.
Right. You're talking about the industrial age, where now we have, through the industrial process, the ability to have our lights on 24/7, and we're embarking on the information age, where we have an exponential rise of information that's available. I think that from my perspective, how I would envision things working is that we have employed a long-term energy policy, and taking that out of our political cycle, reduce the ability to change these things on a very short-term cycle, and allow a longer-term vision of energy production. So we're tying energy to productivity, and tying productivity to happiness. And these are things, I think, and sort of a very simplistic look at these things is a good way just to look at how we look at the problem, and to maintain that consistency over time. So let's say right now new technologies are developing small, portable nuclear reactors to allow greater production, as opposed to beholden to a centrally located nuclear power source. That's one way of addressing that issue. But unfortunately, where that is still on the private sector side, we still have issues with respect to our governmental sector, where the sort of fluctuations in energy policy lead to a great deal of uncertainty.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it also possible that there's, in the political landscape, there are some topics that, from a political standpoint, are better off unsolved? And what I mean by this, so when Obama was president and owned the Congress and the House, right, there was an opportunity there to codify Roe v. Wade, right? Once he was elected and that was set up, there was essentially, that was less of a priority or did not get done, right? Why wouldn't that have gotten done if that was something that was so important? So you could say that other things happen. There's, anyways. But could it also be that some topics are higher up on a voter and power decision-making hierarchy for a voter, that without solving those issues, you're able to then sway them one way or another, so that you can divert the attention to the more granular things that may not be going well in a certain current state?
Well, I think it's good to have some flexibility and some variability on a short time period, especially with respect to issues that are closer to the heart on a smaller scale. On a grander scale, existential questions, I think, are some things that we really need to look at as to put in some kind of a form of bedrock, a constitutional requirement, not just on a national scale but an international scale. And the climate change issue is one such existential question. Now, I think we're making progress towards that. We do believe that we want to maintain a habitable planet. And so such of those issues may just relate to our, again, if you're taking the analogy of the Open Market Committee, Federal Open Market Committee, what we want to increase the temperature of our productivity. So energy and productivity are making a very simple equation, are fairly correlated, and allowing a consistent ability for countries to produce energy, receive energy. That I think something it'd be useful for the long term to allow certainty. A lot of uncertainty in energy production creates problems between nations. In Europe, Russia, the Middle East. These are things that...
Wait, there's more. To listen to the next part of this episode, please follow the platform catalog.